Welcome to the Poisoning Podcast. I'm your host, Erin DeLulo. I ask that you rate, review, and share this episode with a friend. We have a very special guest, and it's back to school time. He wrote an article in Rolling Stone, which is his place of employment, called Inside Snapchat's Teen Opioid Crisis. Please welcome Paul Solotaroff. Paul, thank you for joining us.
A delight to be.
So would you tell our listeners how you started covering the drug epidemic?
Ooh, do you want to go back 35 years when I entered this filthy game? I actually have covered, I stopped counting the number of drug pandemics. It began with peak era crack cocaine in a New York City of the late 80s that was completely decimated by it, that had more or less emerged from the near bankruptcy days of the 70s, and in fact was the tip of the spear for Reaganomic good times on Wall Street. But first cocaine for white Wall Street boys and girls became the party favor du jour. And then by 84, 85, we began to see the first incursions of smokable cocaine. It had always been around in freebase form, but it was so niche that, you really had to be way out on the end of the radial to even think about smoking cocaine. And then along came crack. And crack hollowed out every inner city in America for a good 7, 8, 10 years when I got my first job in journalism at the Village Voice and wrote a story 3, 4 months after I started called Dead Boys about 8, 10, 12-year-old children who had either run away from home or been kicked out or sold by their crackhead parents to pimps, trading sex for crack rocks on the docks of the West Side Highway in Lower Manhattan. That piece was a nuclear bomb when it dropped. It blew up the only nonprofit that claimed to be ministering to homeless children, an outfit called Covenant House, which by and large was a really merit-worthy organization, but it was run by an absolute devil, a Catholic priest named Father Bruce Ritter, who was taking some of the more attractive children and selling them out the back door to his corporate donors. In any event, so crack led into crystal meth. Crystal meth had its big run from, let's say, 01 to 07, 08, migrated from the Pacific Northwest to the Midwest, finally got east. And then what everyone now refers to as the first pandemic, but really was the fourth, fifth, which was the Sackler family's poisoning of America, deliberate poisoning of America, with its invention of and ramrodding through the Food and Drug Administration, a drug called OxyContin, which was an end-of-life narcotic, super powerful opioid, synthetic opioid, that was meant for two places, the operating room and end-of-life hospice care. And they somehow bullied the FDA into greenlighting it as a treatment for everyday aches and pains. And within a year or so of its introduction into the drug supply, in 97, it had completely overwhelmed America's suburbs and exurbs. If you're interested in a really compelling history of that story and how one small town, Appalachia, pulled itself out of the grave, read my story in last summer's Rolling Stone. I believe it was the July issue called Resurrection in Pill City, about the birthplace of the OxyContin pandemic, small town called Portsmouth, Ohio, which, thanks to two superhero um, special forces captains who came home from northern Iraq with blood on their faces and decided they were going to save their town, and they did. And they invented what, to my mind, is the most effective treatment for opioid addiction, which is long-term, 2 years of inpatient and outpatient um, treatment, really robust vocational re-education, um, and then subsidized housing, and then finally the secret ingredient, which is CrossFit. And that cluster of treatments has turned 98-pound zombies who were eating out of dumpsters behind Tim Horton
Mhm.
into 200-pound CrossFit assassins. Thousands of them. So there is treatment, there is hope, but you gotta, in my line of work, shine a light on it. And that's what I did with Snapchat, the exact opposite of what has happened in Portsmouth, Ohio. Snapchat has been an enormously powerful accelerator of what clinicians are calling the fourth wave of the opioid epidemic. So OxyContin, then the DEA begins arresting and shutting down um, the purveyors of pill mills all over America. Enter black tar heroin, which is the second wave of the pandemic. Third wave was powdered fentanyl, which El Chapo and his sons um, sent by the 18-wheeler truckload to Los Angeles, Chicago, and a small town in Massachusetts called Lawrence, and had the market to themselves for a good 4 years. And then someone got the bright idea to go on the dark web, order a brick of pure fentanyl from one of 150,000 unregistered fentanyl manufacturers just in Wuhan province, had it shipped to them by the great new drug mule, the United States Postal Service, and downstairs in their mother's basement, they converted pure fentanyl into fake OxyContin, fake Percocets, fake Xanax, fake Adderall, fake Valium for 4 cents a fake pill, and sold them on Snapchat, much, much less so on Meta, TikTok, and YouTube. But again, their port of choice was Snapchat because of its invisible ink, its disappearing content.
Yeah, it's amazing. One of the reasons I was so drawn to your story is I see the parallels between what the Sacklers business did in starting this, and now there are parallels to just someone creating a channel to continue it. And they're both very big businesses that's goals are just profits.
That's right. And whose collateral victims don't even nudge the profit and loss sheet. In other words, I began, as someone covering the drug war closely, I began to see this massive die-off with the third wave. So the powdered fentanyl that was being shipped
Mhm.
in enormous amounts by El Chapo, his sons, the Chapitos, by their proxies in Tijuana, their rivals in Central and the Eastern Gulf of Mexico. But, and by the way, the victims of
Mm-hmm.
overdoses were by and large no longer street addicts, although plenty of them died
Right.
of overdoses. What we began to see for the first time in American history was white suburban high school kids dying
Yeah.
in prolific numbers. And let me explain very briefly why fentanyl was able to cut down children who had been untouched by prior pandemics. So, in 97, OxyContin becomes a legal pharmaceutical. And the Sacklers lied to the FDA and to doctors and consumers by saying that it was impossible to crush an OxyContin into powder so that it could be snorted or cooked. Every kid in America who liked drugs figured out you could just put an Oxy 30 under your tongue, dissolve the enteric coating within 3 minutes, take it out, put it on a table, get your little hammer, smash it up, and snort it. And after 3 months, you weren't getting high enough. It was time to start shooting. So we began seeing children dying from the first wave, straight OxyContin. What happened by the third wave, when it was in powdered form being sold in $40 baggies, which was enough to get most people high for a day, was that the home chemists who were taking that powdered, pure powdered fentanyl and stepping on it with additives to stretch it, to make money, were mixing it up in $25. If you act by midnight tonight, you get two of them for the low, low price of $25 Magic Bullet blenders. Well, Magic Bullet blender may make a half decent smoothie, but if you are trying to microdose a synthetic opioid that is 50 times stronger than heroin, I'm sorry, yeah, 50 times stronger than heroin and way stronger than OxyContin, you're going to need something a little more industrial to completely integrate every bit, every milligram of that pure fentanyl with baking soda or with aloe scrapings, aloe vera scrapings, very common additive. And it's impossible to do. So, kids buying these baggies of fentanyl were invariably, at some point in their addiction, shooting what's called a hotspot, an undiluted, very difficult to see chunk of pure fentanyl curtains. So a clinical dose, get high dose is 2 milligrams. A chunk would have 30 milligrams. That's an instant toe tag. That's a respiratory failure before the back of your head hits the pillow. And that's what all the children who have died in the last 5 years of fake pharmaceuticals have ingested. An improperly, unevenly distributed amount of fentanyl in someone's basement that cannot possibly be evenly distributed and will kill a kid. May not happen the first time, may not happen the 10th. And as you do fentanyl, your tolerance for it goes up, but it doesn't go from 2 milligrams to 30. You don't get that kind of tolerance until you become the most desperate street addict. And then you still die because you mix it with other drugs. These days, what's killing so many kids is the John Belushi special, which
Mm-hmm.
is cocaine and fentanyl in the same needle.
My. Will you go through one of the stories, the Amy Neville's son and the
Yes.
dealer, and how the story she told you?
So in 2020, something happened to supercharge the fake opioid, fake pharmaceuticals, fake pill pandemic. And that was the big pandemic. That was COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So March 17th, state of Massachusetts went into lockdown. Within a couple of days, the entirety of the continental United States went into lockdown. And you had all these children who were 12, 13, 14, 18, who were suddenly deprived of two crucial things. One, their physical freedom. They couldn't leave the house. But just as important, their emotional tethers, their tribes, their friends, their classmates, the kids that they lived their lives with. They tolerate their parents. They live for their friends,
Yeah.
right? They live for
Oh,
their
yes.
And so by April, May, we started to see this enormous spike in deaths from overdoses. By the way, in 2020, they were still called overdoses. They're not overdoses. They're poisonings.
Exactly.
They're intentional poisonings of children. Because these kids don't know they're taking poison. They think they're taking Valium to get 8 hours of sleep. So,
Mm-hmm.
what happens? By April, May, kids are crawling the walls, right? They can't even go for a bike ride. They can't even go skateboarding, blah, blah, blah. And they can't see their friends. So, what do they turn to? They turn to their phones. They're doom scrolling for 8, 10 hours at a time because what the hell else is there? And by then, Snapchat, like all the other big socials, had its reels, which read the user within seconds and just fed them these dopamine hits of girls in bras and G-strings, or boys with shredded abs, or drug content, and kids could not pry themselves off their social media, where they inevitably ran into dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of people advertising drugs. Not subtly. Big banners. I got X, Y, Z, low prices, highest highs. Alex Neville had just turned 14. He had just graduated 8th grade. He was a kid like so many of the victims of fake pills who was smarter than the average bear. Here's a kid with 145 IQ or better, a kid who mastered the subject of mummification in ancient Egypt by the age of 3, and would go around dressed like a super nerd, first as a pharaoh, as a 3 and 4-year-old, then as a Civil War buff, but he was not a dork. This was a kid with a huge social circle. He was a great skateboarder. He was one of those kids who was out on his surfboard when it was so big that lifeguards wouldn't go in. This is a kid with no fear. He looked like every child in a Korn or Blink 182 video, right? The long androgynous hair, the braces, the Dickie shirt and pants. Upper middle class kid, like all these kids. But he had a touch of ADD. And kids with ADD just automatically have sleep disorders because they've got the ring of fire brain. It doesn't politely and conveniently shut off at 11 o'clock at night. It just churns. So this kid turned first to weed.
Yeah.
Legal weed, dispensary weed,
Okay.
which of course is 20 times stronger than the stuff you and I have been taking liberties here, than I grew up smoking in the 70s. And is, if not addictive, boy, is it psychoactive.
Right.
In any event, at some point the weed didn't work, and it's the pandemic, and so he bought his first pills. And either the first or the third he took killed him dead in his bed. His lovely mother, Amy Neville, a yoga teacher and studio owner par excellence, walked the 20 feet from her bedroom to his bedroom at 8 in the morning to wake him for a dentist appointment and made the discovery that tens of thousands of mothers have made since 2019, which is the sight of her child in what cops call the fentanyl death hose. Blue, wooden chested, meaning if you try and compress, if you try and do CPR, your hands won't go anywhere. Their chests freeze. Spittle or bile on their lips because, yes, these kids went into severe, probably fatal respiratory arrest, but the immediate cause of death is they choked on the last thing they ate in the form of vomit. And so every kid you see on a slab at the coroner's office whose last supper, as it were, was a fentanyl pill, presents in the same way. Blue, wooden-chested, in deep rigor, because typically this happened at midnight and mom or dad or their sib found them at 7 or 8 in the morning, way past the point where there was any hope of resuscitation. Amy Neville, by the way, this happened third week of June 2020, before anybody knows what's going on.
Yeah, the
The
beginning.
CDC has no idea. The DEA barely has a handle on this massive upsurge
Yeah.
in fake pill dealing on Snapchat, and was certainly overwhelmed with cases. The great DEA agent, Bill Bodner, whom I feature in this story, who ran the LA field office for the DEA, was either personally or through his agents responding to 400 fentanyl poisonings in that first year alone, just in Los Angeles County.
Mm.
And
Overwhelming.
invariably being powerless to punish the killer. Why? Because on Snapchat, those texts between dealer and buyer disappear upon reading, or at the very latest within 24 hours. They just vaporize. Then, that's the front end. On Snapchat servers, wherever the fuck those are, they're wiped automatically after 30 days. And by the time the feds were able to get a search warrant out of a judge or an order of retention in Snapchat's hands, that stuff was gone. It was gone. And Snapchat didn't make matters any better by altering its auto default setting to at least keep this content on the back end in their servers. Nope, didn't do it. They claimed they did. They told me over months and months of denials and explanations and rationalizations that they had altered their corporate behavior, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, in 2023 they did. In 2024 maybe. But 2019, 2020, 21, 22. So what Bill Bodner and his task force of super agents were finding was that if you didn't get that kid's phone open within the first 24 hours, good luck. Even though they had a brand new charge, even though they had a new federal statute that allowed the DEA or the federal prosecutor or the county prosecutor to charge a dealer with great bodily harm and death resulting if they sold a kid the fake pill that killed him. Didn't have to prove they knew each other. Didn't have to prove that there had been intent on the part of the dealer to hurt the kid. Didn't have to prove any of that. All you had to do was show that that kid and that dealer were in the same place by using cell tower signals to place them in the same place at the same time. In spite of that new statute, Bill Bodner and his agents were able to bring charges in only 5% of those 400 cases.
Heartbreaking.
So, Amy Neville, a mother with no law enforcement experience, with no investigative childhood, did something unbelievable. She is the Erin Brockovich of the opioid and fake pill pandemic. She got herself educated on how, where, and why fentanyl from China by way of the cartels in Mexico was killing the children of Southern California on Snapchat. She organized this extraordinary, quick force strike of parents who'd lost their babies to fake pills on Snapchat. They made themselves impossible to deal with on the floor of the United States Senate, the floor of the United States Congress. They raised money and they organized these public rallies that got huge local and national TV attention. So, Alex Neville dies late June 2020. Less than a year later, Amy and 100 parents were standing outside Snapchat's headquarters with bullhorns, with huge posters embossed with the faces of their dead children. These stories got picked up everywhere. Cops, local prosecutors suddenly became not only aware, but got themselves educated in how to be effective within those first 24 hours. And you began to see a smattering of cases. But last summer of 2023, I got a call from an extremely senior official at the Department of Justice who said, "Paul, we're helpless. We can't touch Snapchat. We can't get justice for these mothers. We can't catch these dealers and punish them so severely that at least there's some disincentive. Join the fight. Put Snapchat on trial," in the pages of Rolling Stone. And I said, let me look into it. Let me see. First of all, I'm going to be able to prove what you're saying. And second of all, that I'm going to be able to get something out of Snapchat that you have. And after 3 days, I knew that this story was the most important story I'd ever report and write. Now, typically I spend 3 months reporting and writing a story, fact-checking, everything, all in 3 months. This was 9 months. 9 months. There was so much tragedy. There was so much poison afloat. There was so much resistance from Snapchat, so much disinformation, that it became necessary to write a story so overwhelming that it needed an extra 6 months to get everything I possibly could into 10,000 words. In the course of spending those 9 months, or close to it, with Amy Neville and her group of parents in Southern California who'd lost babies, young children, Snapchat, what we began to see was that the loudest parents and their What else did Amy Neville do? She found the one law firm in America that had the money, the courage, and the passion to sue Snapchat for the deaths of these children. And that law firm, the Social Media Victims Law Center in Seattle, if you're listening to this, or you know someone who's lost a kid, write down the name of the Social Media Victims Law Center in Seattle. They now represent thousands of families who have lost children. They have brought the biggest landmark case, drug case in the last 20 years. They broke through and got a judge in Los Angeles to greenlight their lawsuit against Snapchat for the deaths of 65 children and 65 families who'd lost them. Snapchat appealed. We're still waiting for the appellate court to bring down its decision that the lawsuit can go forward. It almost surely will. There are hundreds of families who've already been vetted, waiting in line for the next trial, thousands more online who have not been vetted yet by the law firm. But for the first time, a major social media company is facing an existential threat to its existence in court for the harm it has done to dozens of families. And then the story came out.
Yeah.
And then the story came out. So when these first wave of Snapchat death stories began running in the press, 21, 22, you saw Snapchat's share price go from 80 something dollars a share down to about $8 or whatever it was. It was a fraction of what it had been. The reputational damage to Snapchat was incalculable, but it still was making billions of dollars, at least in
Now,
earnings.
Paul, could
Yeah.
you tell us how the drug dealers would use Snapchat
Yes,
to find these children?
of course. So, whether it was these huge drug banners and ads on Snapchat, or and
Mm-hmm.
posting menus on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, but at the bottom of the ad, posting only their Snapchat handle and saying, if you want any of these, hit me up at blah, 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 Snapchat. So they socialized their menus all over social media, not just Snapchat, but they directed kids to hit them up at Snapchat, where again, disappearing ink. No worries about law enforcement. No worries about Snapchat turning them in. Snapchat didn't do that. Claims it did would show me no evidence that it had. So these kids are bombarded. And again, it's not just the big socials. It's every app that has two-way engagement. So Match.com. Yes. Etsy. Yes, Etsy. All of these apps, you would never in your wildest dreams think to go to look at drug content. Suddenly had drug content everywhere because it's hard to stop, costs a lot of money to hire feed managers, the people who actually remove stuff, right? Um, and Snapchat took a long time to staff up, both on its enforcement side and on its vigilance side. So,
Last week, Paul, I
yeah.
interviewed the head of Kansas's
Mm.
Bureau of Investigation. And he is a huge, I mean, he spends most of his job fighting fentanyl
Yeah.
and the distribution of it and just his state. But he was specifically saying to me that we have to rule these deaths as homicides, not as overdoses, because, which is great in law enforcement, because we have to immediately preserve the evidence,
Right.
which plays into your story.
Right. But again, drug dealers aren't stupid. They're
No.
monsters, but they're not stupid. You know, the days when drug dealers could call themselves, you know, psychedelic pharmacists, those days are gone.
Mm-hmm.
They're just murderers now. They know that putting fentanyl in everything is death. And they have got to be dealt with as murderers and attempted murderers, and nothing short of, however, and all respect to your interview subject last week, who I'm sure is fighting the good fight with everything he's got. There is no arresting our way out of this. There is no prosecuting our way out of this. There is only letting every kid and every parent in America know what is being pitched to the most vulnerable consumers in America. Short of that, we will continue to see what the CDC says is 110,000 dead a year. That's bogus. It's at least double that, and they know it, because you can only rule something a drug overdose or a fentanyl poisoning if you do blood analysis to get a clear cause of death. And in so many of these cases, that's not possible.
So what's your stance on Narcan, Paul? Do you keep it on you?
We have it in the house. There is no one in my house who uses opioids in any form, but yes, it's in the family, which is to say that my family is one of probably 100 million in this country that has been very closely touched by opioid abuse. And, you know, the days when we could all politely agree that this was someone else's problem, that it was that side of town's problem, those days are
Right.
gone forever. This is all of us. And it drives me insane that
Mm-hmm.
nobody's talking about this at a national policy level. It is malpractice not to have massive messaging done by the federal government, massive messaging by state and county governments. Every third billboard, every third PSA should be driving the point home: if you are buying drugs online, you'll die. Done.
Exactly. So what advice do you have to parents after doing all this research, Paul?
Better have that conversation with your kids. And I know how hard it is to just find out what they're eating when they're not in your company, to just find out what they're sending each other by way of pictures. Snapchat invented sexting, by the way. They didn't invent it, they perfected it for children.
Wow.
But if you don't have that conversation with your kids, and you don't have the emotional bandwidth to say, the drugs I did in my day didn't kill us. The drugs in your day allow not one mistake. You don't get to screw up and learn from it. Your first lesson is your final. And I love you more than anything. I can't bear the idea of walking down the hall and finding you blue in your bed. Please, for the love of God, don't do this. And tell me if someone is trying to persuade you to do otherwise, because they ain't your friend.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, thank you for your time, Paul. Everyone, please read Paul's article on Rolling Stone. It's so important.
Thank you.
Welcome. I ask that you rate, review, and share this episode with a friend.